Today's daf is daf ayin ches. And we start on the second line. Amar Rav Yehuda, Kohen Gadol bi'almona lokesh shtayim. So we're talking now about the chiyuvim that apply to a Kohen who marries a woman that he's prohibited from marrying. In the case of a Kohen Gadol who marries an almona, he violates two different lavim, and he gets two different sets of malchus. Achas mishum almona gusha halol zonas elo yikach, v'achas mishum lo yechal zaro. In other words, number one, he violates the lav of marrying an almona, and number two, he also violates a lav through his be'ilah by being mechalel, and he's mechal his wife. For example, she becomes a chalala because any violation of an Iser kahuna through bia generates a psul of chalalos. Frekta Gemara of a lilkei navi, there should be a third set of malchus, mishum lo yechal zaro, and the children born to this bia of a Kohen Gadol to an almana are chalolim, and he was therefore mechal zaro. And the Gemara answers be shalo gomar biyaso. We're talking about a case where there was no gomar bia, and therefore she cannot be impregnated without a gomar bia. As far as chil ha'isha, you need a ma'isa bia, and ha'ara, which is tchilas bia, constitutes a bia, and therefore she's mischaleles. He gets malchus for that bia, but he does not violate lo yechal zaro in a case where he didn't finish his bia, because it's only with Kumar bia that she could possibly become pregnant. Kumar asks Masiv Rava. Rava raises the fine kash on Rabbi Yehuda from a Mishnah in Masechet Makas Daf Yud Gimel. If a Kohen Gadol has a relationship with an almana, the grusha, so she's both an almana from one husband and a grusha from the second, and now the Kohen Gadol has violated two different prohibitions, one prohibition of an almana and another prohibition of a grusha. And it says in the Mishnah in Makis that loke mishum shnei shemos. He gets two sets of malchus, one's for the lav, the isur of almana, and the other for the isur of grusha. My lav, shnei shemos v'sulo. Now, according to your understanding, we can max out as at a third set of malchus, assuming there was Kmar Bia, and that's Lo Yechal Zaro. But the Mishnah in Makis maxes out at Shnei Shemos, implying not more than Shnei Shemos. And the Gemara answers Lo. The Mishnah doesn't mean to say that maximum there are only two sets of malchus, one for Almana and one for Grusha. The Mishnah is only pointing out that Shnei Shemos al Zeh, Ushnei Shemos al Zeh, which means that he violates two different isurim, one of almana and one on grusha, and both will be violated by lo yikach in a case where he marries her. And if he consummates the marriage with a ma'isa bia, then he'll get a violation of two sets of malchus for two different isurim, and those are almana grusha. As far as an additional Isur, Nevi Lo Yechal Zaro, that wasn't the discussion of the Mishnah at all. So the Gemara asks Yehachi, if this be the case, then in the case of Grusha, he gets Malchus of Shtayim, Amos Seifa. What do we do with the Seifa? That Mishnah, it says, Begrusha v'chalutza, Eino Chayv El Al Achas. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he should get two sets of Malchus. Why is it that the Mishnah establishes that if the Kohen had a relationship with a Grusha who's also a Chalutza, he's only Chayav one? Hachi Karmel Gemara answers, what does the Mishnah have in mind? Eino Chayav Ela Al Achas Uyolam Shnei Shemos. He only violates the Isa Grusha, and Chalutza is only an Isa Derabanan, and he'll get Malchus for Shnei Shemos, one for the Lekicha, for the marriage, and the second for the Bia, which is Chilul. As far as Chalutza is concerned, there's no Malchus, because the Isa Chalutza is only the Rabbanan. So Gemara asks, Chalutza v'Chalutza v'Rabbanan? Is that really so? And you don't get Malchus for Chalutza? Vasanya, I'll bring you a brisa. The brisa darshans a pasuk in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, Parashas Emor. It says Ve'isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu. Ein li'ela grusha chalutza minayin tamalomer ve'isha. The vav of ve'isha is a redundant vav, and it comes as a ribui to add chalutza. So we see that chalutza is derived from this pasuk, and therefore it's included in the Eastern Torah. So why isn't there no any malchus for chalutza? Why are you telling me that chalutza is only the Rabbanon? Gemara answers, "Mirabbanon cross machta bi'alma." In a very typical style, the Gemara answers that sometimes the drush is not a real, genuine, full-fledged drasha, yalfusa, but rather it's just an asmachta. When the Chachamim institute their isurim, very often they hang their cloak on a peg, which is called an asmachta, and they find a smach in the Torah. Amar Abaye Kidesh. Now we have machlok shin Abaye and Rava. If the Kohen was Makadesh, any woman that's Asurla Loke and Baal Loke gets a second set of malchus for the Be'ilo. Kidesh Loke Vishum Lo Yikach, Baal Loke Vishum Lo Yichal. Abai postulates that there's two independent lavim here, and each one generates its own set of malchus. One is for the Kiddushin, the Kicha, and a second one for the Be'ilo of Lo Yichala, because through this Be'ilo is Machal Isha. Rava Amar, Baal Loke, Lo Baal Eno Loke. According to Rava, for the Kiddushin alone, there is no malchus, there's no full-fledged violation of a lav. The lav is dependent upon the Be'ila. And if there was a Lakicha, but without any Be'ila, there's no malchus. So unlike Abaye, who postulates a separate independent lav of malchus derived from the pasuk Lo Yikach, Rava rejects that. And he says that when you read Lo Yikach, you read it together with Lo Yichalel. In other words, Ma'atam. When the Torah says Lo Yikach and then Lo Yichal, the Lo Yichal is explaining why Lo Yikach. Because if we allow him to marry her, he'll probably come to consummate the marriage with Be'ila and then violate the lav of Lo Yichal. So there's no independent lav, according to Rava, of Lo Yikach. Hence, Kidesh V'lo Baal Eino Loke. And now the Gemara is going to limit the scope, reduce the scope of the machlok shin Abaye v'Rava, mentioning scenarios in which Abaye concedes to Rava and vice versa. Moda Abaye b'machzer grushasa. A man divorces his wife, she gets married to another man, and then after he is out of the picture, he divorces her, he dies, he, the original Baal, is Makadish her again. And in doing so, he violates the lav in Parashas Ki Teitze Lo Yuchal Bailo Rishon Shel Chil Lo Shuv Lekachto Lios Lisha Chesher Utama. Says Abaye, Im Kidesh V'lo Baal Eino Loke. Here, Abaye concedes to Rava that he will not violate the lav of Lo Yuchal Lekachta through marriage alone, and he will only violate the lav with bia. Why? Lekachta lios lo leisha amar Rachmana. The Torah used the term lekachta lios lo leisha, emphasizing that the lav itself is a result of the fact of kicha, of the fact of kiddushin, and therefore, if kidesh now lios lo leisha, what does that mean? Lios leisha, the kiddushin will now culminate in bia. So it's as if the Torah had said that the Kiddushin is prohibited because of the bia that follows it. And lekachta in the Torah here, which the Torah prohibits, is only a kicha that at the end culminates with lios leisha, which means bia. And therefore, hal leka, if he only has Kiddushin without bia, then although it's lekachta, but it wasn't Lios lo leisha, and therefore he doesn't get malchus. Now, on the other end, the other court of Rava, Moda Rava bekoin gadol Bi'almona, that if a man marries, he's a Kohen Gadol, marries an almona, she'im bal v'lo kidesh shaloka, he gets malchus for be'ila without Kiddushin. In other words, the be'ila is an independent lav, and it's not dependent upon Kiddushin. Why? Because below Yechal Zaro B'Yamav Omar Achmana. And the violation of Yechal Zaro has nothing to do with Kiddushin, but rather Hu Chilel, V'Bilaso Hu Chilel. He was Machalel, the Almona. So whereas Rava would say that in the other Isurim that apply other than Kohen Gadol to Kohanim, then if the marriage culminates in Be'ila, he gets Malchus. And the reason why the Torah prohibits Kiddushin lo yikach is because of lo yichal, the Be'ila. So the Kiddushin itself would not generate Malchus. But what happens if he had Be'ila without Kiddushin? I think, if I understand the Gemara correctly, in such a case of Be'ila without Kiddushin, according to Rava, he would not get Malchus. You need a violation of lo yikach and v'lo yichalel. So Kidesh v'lo Baal, and there was no chilul, he doesn't violate the Isur. But what about a case of Baal v'lo Kidesh? Baal v'lo Kidesh. It's again, it says that Moda Rava, the Kohen Gadol, in Bavlo Kiddush Loka. So it's implying that in other Isurei Kahuna, Bavlo Kiddush Eino Loka. That's what I think is going on here. Let me just check in the footnote if he supports what I said. In other words, the way we read the Gemara is the straightforward meaning of the Gemara, but the Rishonim rejected. I'll read to you the language. He says, Mahu zesha rava modeh sheba loke. Hello, kain heim divrei rav mitchila shalokin al habeila. But let's see the Gemara, let's see the answer of the Rishonim. Pirush Ramban, Shahaya Ef Shalomar Shekmosha Rava Sovesh over Kiddushin Levad Alo Yikach. Fine. Kain Lo Yilke Alo Yechal Bebe'il Lechud, which is what we wanted to suggest in the way we read the Gemara. Lachein Chicha Gemara Shehalo Yechalel Misparish. Is that a general rule? Umilvad zeh hu piresh lelav shelo yikach. Said over him all of Belisha Mechal B'Bia. It's not clear to me whether Ramban is saying that as a general rule, because the Gemara seems to say that it's only with regard to Kohen Gadol be'almona. So we'll have to leave that for more research. I don't know if you have anything in your Gemara. Question is, what's the deal according to Rava in Baal v'lo Kiddush other than Kohen Gadol b'Almana. Ushneim, the Gemara says, Avai v'Rava, Modim b'machse gushoso she'im Baal v'lo Kiddush she'eno loke. Then in the case of Machse Gushoso, he doesn't get Malchus for the Be'ilah because the Torah did not specify Be'ilah in this lav, but rather, what was the pasuk? It says, Lo yuchal loshuv lekachto. So the emphasis is on lekicha, and that means it's got to be derech Kiddushin. So the Isra of Leos Lo Leisha, which means Bia, is through derech Kiddushin. And therefore, Be'ilah alone would not generate Malchus. It's got to be Be'ilah with Kiddushin. The Mishnah establishes that Rav Yehuda Omer Bas Ger Zocher Kebas Cholol, that just like Chalolis is passed on through the generations through the father who's a Cholol, so too the Psul of Chalolis is passed down through the generations if the father was a Ger. Tanya, we learned in the Bryce, Rav Yehuda Omer Bas Ger Zocher Kebas Cholol Zocher, which means she's Psul Kuhuna. If I didn't know, say, and then I could derive this from a kol v'chomer, ma chol sheba mitipa kshera. In other words, the father was originally kosher, and nevertheless, bito psula is ger sheba mitipa psula, eno din shebito psula. So he means that a ger is that much more of a psul than a cholol, because a cholol comes through tipa kshera. Whereas a ger comes through tipa srucha, tipa psul. So let's say the Kohen Gadol, for example, has a relationship with an almana. He himself, the Kohen Gadol, is bami tipa kshera, but yet the child from such a relationship is a cholol. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. I have a pirch on this kal v'chomer. Malach cholol shekei yitzirasa ba'avera. In other words, the bia itself from which this son or daughter was conceived was a bias avera of a kohen gadol to an almana, and therefore we understand why the bas who's born from this avera is psula. But in the case of a ger whose parents, let's say, are goyim, but he himself is a ger, so his conception is not a bias isur. I mean, a goy had a relation with a goy, and therefore maybe the bas is kshera. And Gemara rejects this. You can't say that there's a chumrah in chol because of yitzirasa ba'avera, because I'll prove it to you from Kohen Gadol ba'almani ofiach she'ein yitzirasa ba'avera. The Kohen Gadol doesn't have a yitzir ba'avera, and yet Vito, a daughter who was born to a marriage with a Kohen Gadol and an almana, psula. So forget about this concept of yitzirasa ba'avera. Leave it out. So Gemara asks, that's not a correct rejection. Malach Kohen Gadol ba'almana came be also be'avera. So forget about yitzirasa ba'avera. In the case of a Kohen Gadol to an almana, you have yitzira ba'avera. So maybe the reason why the bas who's born to such a relationship is psula is because of a bias avera. But ger, who had a relationship with the Yisraelis beheter, maybe the bas is not psula. And the Gemara answers chol yochiach. Why? Because chol is a case where the bia was a bia muteres. Forget about Kohen Gadol with an almana, that's a bias avera. But let's say, for example, a chol has a relationship with the Yisraelis, that's pure heter. And yet the bas is psula insofar as hayichus is boss of the father, who's a chol. And therefore, the Gemara says now we have what's called a tzad hashava. Each one of the two pirchas stands alone And the pircha in the case of almana is biyasa bavera. The pircha in the case of chol is yitziraso bipsul. So right, in the case of chol, you have yitzira bavera. In the case of kohen gadol, you have bia bavera without yitzira bavera. And therefore, the lowest common denominator between these two is she'enon berov kol, meaning they're different from most of the kahal of Yisrael. This is yitzirasa bavera, this is biasa bavera. Afani obvious yager she'en eno berov kol. He was nolad mitipa psula, and therefore bito psula. The Gemara now rejects the Bamei Tzad. Meaning the Chol himself became a Chol because of an Avera, if his father was married to a Grusha Zonova, etc. And the Kohen Gadol has a relation with an Almana, which is an Avera. So that's what causes the Psul in the Bas. But in the case of Ger Aval Yisraelis, there's no Avera at all. So how can you derive the conclusion that Bito Psula? So the Gemara tries a different Tzad Shava. Lo Tema Kohen Gadol B'Almana Yochiach Ela Ema Mitzri Rishon Yochiach. Because Mitzri Rishon is not what you call Yitzirasa Bavera, nor is it Biasa Bavera, and yet the Bas is Psula Lava Bakol. Gemara rejects that too. Mala Mitzri Rishon Shekain Eino Roy Lava Bakol at all. He's completely excluded from the Kahal. And therefore we say that Bito Psula, but Ger is allowed to enter into the Kol. Maybe his Bas is Kshera. And the Gemara says, Chol Yochia. He's mutter level of Kol, and yet Bito Psula. Chazar V'Hadin. Lo Roy Zeh K'Roy Zeh. Each one has its own pircha. In the case of a chol, we said it was yitzirasa bavera, and that creates the psul. In the case of mitzri sheni, even though there's no yitzir bavera, the bas is psula. Why? Because ein roy lovo lekol is malat tzad shavish bahen she'ein barov kol ubito psula afani obvious ager she'ein barov kol becomes a deep psula, and therefore bito psula. Gemara rejects that as well. Malat tzad shavish bahen. Shekain poslim b'viyasam. In both the cases of Cholol and Ger Mitzri, there's a psul through the bia of the woman who's niveles. And that's not true in the case of a Ger. A regular Ger, if he's not a Mitzri Sheni, he doesn't passel his wife b'viyasam. And this is all based on a brisa that we learned back on Daf Ayin Daled. Amid Beis, with regard to a Ben Teisha Shana V'Yom Echad, who's royal Abiyah, and if he's a Ger Mitzri or a Cholol, he passels his wife B'Biyasa. But that's not true in the case of a Ger. So at this point, if we want to make an interim summary, the Gemara rejects all the different ways through which we could possibly derive that a Bas Ger Zachar is Psula Kahuna. And even if you introduce a tzad shav of chol and ger mitzri, but since both are poslim is ishtam b'biyaso, that's the chumrah of those two cases, mashen kebeger, in a regular ger. So Gemara now explains Rabbi Yehuda, who comes to the conclusion that bas ger psula kuna is ger nami posel b'biyaso. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that a ger passels his wife b'biyasa. U'maisi law, and now he is free, without any obstruction, to derive a b'mei tzad mehai dina. Right, he could derive from a b'mei tzad that the bas is psul lakuna, and this is the limit. Chol is ba mitipa kshera, but he passels his wife b'biyasa. Ger comes from a tipa psula. How much more so he should passel his wife bibia? You'll say chol is yitzirasa bavera, so then I'll introduce ger mitzri she'ein yitzirasa bavera. So we're going to derive from Cholol and Ger Mitzri, which are Einam Barov Kol, who posels Ishto B'Viyasa, so to Ger, who's not Barov Kol, posels his wife B'Viyasa. And if that be the case, now we have a din of, we can derive the din of Bas HaGer, Bas Cholol, through the Vameh Tzad of Cholol and Ger Mitzri. Now we cannot reject it by saying that the reason for the psul in those two cases is because Biyasam Poselis as a Isha, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that even Bias Ger pasels the Isha. The Mishnah mentions Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, who says that if a Yisrael marries a Gioris, the Bas is Ksher Lakuna. And so too, if a Ger marries a Bas Yisrael, the daughter of such a marriage is Ksher Lakuna. And basically, the way Rashi explains it is Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov holds that you don't derive from a tzad hashava because it's what you call a tzad chumrah. In each one of the tzadim, there's a certain chumrah, right? The chumrah of Cholol, that he's Yitziyasa Bavera, the chumrah of Mitzri Rishon, because he's ain't a royal level of Kol. So that's called tzad chumrah. And the Gemara says in Makkos Daf Dalet and Beis that according to one shita, there's no pircha on a tzad hashava which has the same chumrah. So it's that pircha of malatzad hashava shekein yeshnam tzad chamur. If they're two different malamdim with two different chumras, that's not a pircha on a bameh matzina. So that's going to be the shita of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Tanya, we learned to the Bryce Reb Shimon Yochai Omer Ki Yores Chusa V'Bashal Shonim Yom Echad Sheira L'Kuna Shenema. In other words, if the gerus took place before the girl reached 3 years of age, so she wasn't Ru'il Abi at the time of the gerus, then she can marry Kohen. Shenemar, in the Milchemes Midjan, when Moshe addresses the Anshe Atzava that came to the Milchama, he says, V'chol ataf banoshim hechiyu lachem. And taf banoshim is a reference to a girl who's less than 3 years old. And what is hechiyu lachem? Lachem means to marriage. So marriage. Pinchas was also included amongst the Yotzei Tzava in the Milchemes Midjan. So therefore, it must mean that Hachi Lachem means even for Pinchas a Kohen, he's allowed to marry a girl who is a Gioris Pchusa Mibash Sholoshan. Rabbanan would say that every Gioris is by definition Asura LeKohen. How do they deal with the pasuk that Rabbi Yehuda uses to derive his conclusion? Hachi lachem lavadim u'shvachos. Hachi lachem doesn't mean for nesuin, but rather it means that these will be your avodim and your shvachos. So we have 4 different shitas in sum with regard to a baskerim lekuhuna. Number 1, we have 3 shitas mentioned in the Mishnah, and another 4th in the Brisa. We have in the Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda holds that a bas ger zachar is psula, even though he married a Yisraelis. We have Rabbi Eliezer who says if there's one side of Yisrael, then the child is kosher, the daughter is not psula. But if both the father and the mother are gerim, then the bas is psula. And then Rabbi Yosef says even if both the father and the mother are gerim, nevertheless the bas is ksherim. Finally, we have in the Brisa the sheet of Reb Shimon, who says that even the Gioris herself is Kshera, as long as her Gioris took place before the age of Royal Labia, meaning before 3. Bekula Mikreach and Darshu. All these Tanoim had their own interpretation of one single pasuk, a strange pasuk in Yechezkel Mem Daled. I forgot exactly which parasha. Oh, I think we read it as the Haftorah for Parashas Emor. Double check me on that. And the pasuk says, "Almanu grushalo yiklu lehem lenashim," which sounds like we're addressing a Kohen Gadol. Kiyim v'sulas mizera beis Yisrael, and the Kohen Gadol is enjoined to marry Basula. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, ad is kol zera mi Yisrael, until the Ikar is called Zera, meaning the Zera comes from the Av, he's the Ikar, and it's got to be Mi Yisrael. So the Bas Ger Zocher is Psula because the Ikar Zera is not from Yisrael, but rather from the Ger. Rabbi Lezer and Yaakov Sovar, Mizera, and the extra mem in the word Mizera is mashma afilu mikta zera. Even if there's only partial zera, meaning it's either the zera the aim or the zera the av, I'm going to be machshir. And such a child is called Basulas Mizera Beis Yisrael because one of the two parents are Gerim. Or shall we say it the other way around, one of the two parents are Yisraeli. Rabbi Yossi Sarah Misha Nizro Yisrael. If there was Horah B'Kedusha after the Gerus, and the parents had already undergone Gerus before the Horah, before the conception, that's called Zera Yisrael. And therefore, even the Bas of a Ger and a Gerus is Ksher of Shimon ben Yochanan, Savar, Misha Nizru B'Sulel B'Yisrael. What does it mean, Nizru B'Sulel? Godlu v'Nigru B'Sulel. After she became a member of Klal Yisrael. So what that means is that when she becomes Shol Shalom V'Echad, then it's called Nizru B'Sulel, and if that took place, her third birthday before, or let's say after the Gerus, that's called Mizera Yisrael. She became what? She became 3 years old after the Gerus. That's called Mizera Yisrael, and she's allowed to marry a Kohen. Amalei Rav Nachman l'Rava. So Rav Nachman asks the question to Rava,